Perrin tensed to grab her. He did not think she would actually draw on the man, but then again, he was not sure enough of her, or any of her ridiculous friends, to put it out of the question. Bulwer merely watched her, his head tilted to one side, and his smell carried impatience, not concern. With a toss of her head, Solanda turned her attention to Perrin. "I see you, Lord Perrin Goldeneyes," she began in the crisp accents of Carian, but aware that he had little patience for her pretend Aiel formality, she hurried on. "I have learned 3 things tonight. First, the least important. Aviar reported that Massima sent another rider back toward Amadisia yesterday. Nerion tried to follow, but lost him." "Tell Nerion I said he isn't to follow anybody," Perrin told her sharply. "And tell Aviar the same. They should know that. They are to watch, listen, and report what they see and hear, no more. Do you understand me?" Solanda gave a quick nod, a thorn of fear entering her scent for a moment. Fear of him, Perrin supposed. Fear that he was angry with her. Yellow eyes on a man made some people uneasy. He took his hand from his axe and clasped both hands behind his back. Aviar and Nerion were more of Fail's 24 young fools, one Tyran, the other Carianan. Fail had used a lot of them for eyes and ears, a fact that still irritated him for some reason, though she had told him to his face that spying was a wife's business. A man needed to listen hard when he thought his wife was joking. She might not be. The whole notion of spying made him uncomfortable, but if Fail could use them so, then so could her husband, when there was need. Just the two, though. Massima seemed convinced that everyone except dark friends were fated to follow him sooner or later, yet he might grow suspicious if too many left Perrin's camp to join him. "Don't call him Massima, not even here," he added brusquely. Lately the man claimed Massima Dagar was actually dead and risen from the grave as the prophet of the Lord Dragon reborn, and he was touchier than ever about mention of his former name. "You get careless with your tongue in the wrong place, and you might be lucky if he just has a few of his bully boys flog you the next time they can find you alone." Solanda nodded again, gravely, this time without any fear smell. Light. Those idiots of Fail's lack the sense to recognize what they should be afraid of. "It's almost dawn," Bulwer murmured, shivering and pulling his cloak tighter. "All will be waking before long, and some matters are best discussed unseen. If my lady will continue?" Once again, that was more than a suggestion. Solanda and the rest of Fail's hangers-on had been good only for causing trouble, that Perrin could see, and Bulwer looked to be trying to put a fly up her nose for some reason, but she actually gave an embarrassed start and murmured an apology. The darkness truly was beginning to lessen, Perrin realized, at least to his eyes. The sky overhead still looked black, dusted with bright stars, yet he could almost make out the colors of the 6 thin stripes that crossed the front of Solanda's coat. He could tell one from another, anyway. The realization that he had slept later than usual made him growl. He could not afford to give in to weariness, however tired he was. He needed to hear Solanda's report. She would not be worried about Massima sending out riders. The man did that almost every day. Yet he looked anxiously for Aram and Stepper. His ears picked up the sounds of activity among the horse lines, but there was no sign of his horse yet. "The second thing, my lord," Solanda said, "is that Javier has seen casks of salt fish and salt beef, branded with Altaran markings, a great many of them. He says there are Altarans among the prophet's people too. Several appear to be craftsfolk, and 1 or 2 could be merchants or town officials. Established men and women in any case, solid folk. And some seem unsure they made the right decision. A few questions might reveal from where the fish and beef came, and perhaps gain more eyes and ears for you." "I know where the fish and beef came from, and so do you," Perrin said irritably. His hands knotted into fists behind his back. He had hoped the speed with which he was moving would keep Massima from sending out raiding parties. That was what they were, and as bad as the Shido, if not worse. They offered people a chance to swear to the Dragon Reborn, and those who refused, sometimes those who simply hesitated too long, died by fire and steel. In any case, whether or not they marched off to follow Massima, those who swore were expected to donate generously in support of the Prophet's cause, while those who died were plainly dark friends, their belongings forfeit. Thieves lost a hand by Massima's laws, but none of what his raiders did was thieving, according to Massima. By his laws, murder and a whole host of other crimes merited hanging, Yet a fair number of his followers seemed to prefer killing to receiving oaths. There was more loot that way, and for some of them, murder was a fine game to play before eating. Tell them to keep clear of these Altarans, Perrin went on. All sorts drift into Massima's following, and even if they are having second thoughts, it won't take them long to stink of zeal like the rest. They wouldn't hesitate to cut a neighbor then, much less somebody who's asked the wrong questions.
Give me 1 second again.
What I want to know is what Massima's doing, what he's planning. But the man had some scheme seemed obvious. Massima claimed it was blasphemy for anyone except Rand to touch the One Power, claimed he wanted nothing more than to join Rand in the East. As always, thought of Rand brought colors whirling through Perrin's head, more vividly than usual this time, but anger melted them to vapor. Blasphemy or no, Massima had accepted traveling, which was not just channeling, but men channeling. And no matter what he claimed, he had done it to remain in the West as long as possible, not to help rescue Fail. Perrin tended to trust people until they proved unreliable. But one sniff of Massima had told him the fellow was as insane as a rabid animal, and less trustworthy. He had considered ways to stop whatever it was, ways to stop Massima's killing and burning. Massima had 10 or 12,000 men with him, maybe more. The man was not very forthcoming about numbers, and the way they camped in a squalid sprawl made counting impossible. While less than a quarter of that number followed Perrin, several hundred of them cart drivers and grooms and others who would be more hindrance than help in a fight. Yet with 3 Aes Sedai and 2 Ashaman, not to mention 6 Aiel Wise Ones, he could help Massima in his tracks. The Wise Ones and 2 of the Aes Sedai would be eager to take part, more than simply willing, at least. They wanted Massima dead, but dispersing Massima's army would only break it into hundreds of smaller bands that would scatter across Altara and beyond, still looting and killing, just for themselves instead of in the name of the Dragon Reborn. Breaking the Shadow will do the same thing, he thought, and pushed the thought away. Stopping Massima would take time he did not have. The man would have to keep until Fail was safe, until the Shadow was smashed to kindling. What's the third thing you learned tonight, Salanda? He said roughly. To his surprise, the smell of worry coming from the woman thickened. Javier saw someone, she said slowly. He did not tell me at first. Her voice hardened for a moment. I made sure that will not happen again. Drawing a deep breath, she seemed to struggle with herself, then burst out. Masuri Sedai has visited Massima. The prophet. It is true, my lord, believe me. Javier has seen her more than once. She slips into their camp hooded and leaves the same way. But he hasn't looked at her face twice. A man each time, and sometimes another woman. Javier has not seen the man well enough to be sure, but the description fits Rover, Masuri's warder, and Javier is certain the second woman is Anura Sedai. She broke off abruptly, her eyes shining darkly in the moonlight as she watched him. Light she was as worried about how he would take it as by what it meant. He forced his hands to unclench. Massima despised Aes Sedai as much as he did dark friends. He nearly considered them dark friends. So why would he receive 2 sisters? Why would they go to him? Anura's opinion of Massima lay hidden behind Aes Sedai mystery and double-jointed comments that could mean anything. But Masuri had said straight out that the man needed to be put down like a mad dog. Make sure Javier and Nerion keep a sharp eye for the sisters, and see if they can eavesdrop on one of their meetings with Massima. Would Javier be mistaken? No. There were a few women in Massima's camp, relatively speaking, and it passed belief that the tyrant could mistake one of those murderous eye paradins. The sort of women willing to march with Massima usually made the men look like tinkers. Tell them to take care, though. Better to let the chance pass than get caught at it. They're no good to anyone strung up on a tree. Perrin knew he sounded gruff and tried to make his voice milder. That seemed harder since Fail was kidnapped. You've done well, Salanda. At least he did not sound as if he were barking at her. You and Javier and Nerion. Fail would be proud if she knew. A smile lit up her face, and she stood a little straighter, if that was possible. Pride, clean and bright, the pride of accomplishment, almost overwhelmed any other scent from her. Thank you, my lord. Thank you. You would have thought he had given her a prize. Maybe he had, come to think on it. Though, come to think, Fail might not be best pleased that he was using her eyes and ears, or even knew about them. Once the thought of Fail displeased would have made him uneasy, but that was before he learned about her spies, and that little matter of the broken crown that Elias had let slip. Everybody always said that wives kept their secrets close, but there were limits. Adjusting his cloak on his narrow shoulders with one hand, Bulwer coughed behind the other. Well said, my lord. Very well said. My lady, I'm sure you want to pass on Lord Perrin's instructions as soon as possible. It wouldn't do for there to be any misunderstanding. Solanda nodded without taking her eyes off Perrin. Her mouth opened, and Perrin was sure she intended to say something about hoping he found water and shade. Light. Water was the one thing they had in plenty, even if it was mostly frozen. And this time of year, nobody needed shade even at noon. She probably did intend it because she hesitated before saying, Grace favor you, my lord. If I may be so bold, Grace has favored the Lady Fail in you. Perrin jerked his head in a nod of thanks. There was a taste of ashes in his mouth. Grace had a funny way of favoring Fail, giving her a husband who still had not found her after more than 2 weeks of searching. The maidens said she had been made Gaishan, that she would not be mistreated, but they had to admit these Shido already had broken their customs 100 different ways. In his book, being kidnapped was mistreatment enough. Bitter ashes. The lady will do very well, my lord, Bulwer said softly, watching Solanda vanish into the darkness among the carts. This approval was a surprise. He had tried to talk Perrin out of using Solanda and her friends on the grounds they were hot-headed and unreliable. She has the necessary instincts. Carrion and do, usually, and tyrants to some extent. At least the nobles, especially once. He cut off abruptly, and eyed Perrin cautiously. If he were another man, Perrin would have believed he had said more than he intended, but he doubted Bulwer slipped in that fashion. The man's scent remained steady, not jiggling the way it would in a man who was unsure. May I offer 1 or 2 points on her report, my lord? The crunch of hooves in the snow announced the approach of Aram, leading Perrin's dun stallion and his own rangy gray gelding. The 2 animals were trying to nip at one another, and Aram was keeping them well apart, though with some difficulty. Bulwer sighed. You can say whatever you need to in front of Aram, Master Bulwer, Perrin said. The little man bowed his head in acquiescence, but he sighed again, too. Everybody in the camp knew that Bulwer had the skill of fitting together rumors and chance-heard comments and things people had done to form a picture of what had really happened or what might. And Bulwer himself considered that part of his job as a secretary, but for some reason he liked to pretend he never did any such thing. It was a harmless pretense, and Perrin tended to humor him. Taking Stepper's reins from Aram, he said, Walk behind us a while, Aram. I need to talk with Master Bulwer in private. Bulwer's sigh was so faint that Perrin barely heard it. Aram fell in behind the 2 of them without a word as they began to walk, frozen snow cracking beneath their feet. But his scent grew spiky again, and quivery, a thin, sour smell. This time Perrin recognized the scent, though he paid it no more mind than usual. Aram was jealous of anyone except Fail who spent time with him. Perrin saw no way to put a stop to it, and anyway, he was as used to Aram's possessiveness as he was to the way Bulwer hopped along at his side, glancing over his shoulder to see whether Aram was close enough to hear when he finally decided to speak. Bulwer's razor-thin scent of suspicion, curiously dry and not even warm, but still suspicion, provided a counterpoint to Aram's jealousy. You could not change men who did not want to change. The horse lines and supply carts were located in the middle of the camp, where thieves would have a hard time reaching them. And although the sky still looked black to most eyes, the cart drivers and grooms, who slept close to their charges, were already awake and folding their blankets, some tending shelters made of pine boughs, and other small tree limbs harvested from the surrounding forest, in case they might be needed another night. Cook fires were being lit and small black kettles set over them, though there was little to eat except porridge or dried beans. Hunting and trapping added some meat, venison and rabbits, partridges and wood hens and the like, but that could only go so far with so many to feed, and there had been nowhere to buy supplies since before crossing the Eldar. A ripple of bows and curtsies and murmurs of a good morning, my lord, and the light favor you, my lord, followed Perrin, but the men and women who saw him stopped trying to strengthen their shelters, and a few began to pull theirs down, as though they had sensed his determination from his stride. They should have known his resolve by now. Since the day he realized how badly he had blundered, he had not spent 2 nights in one place. He returned the greetings without slowing. The rest of the camp made a thin ring around the horses and carts, facing the encircling forest, with the two rivers men divided into 4 groups, and the lancers from Gildan and Mayenne spaced between them. Whoever came with them, from whatever direction, would face 2 rivers longbows and trained cavalry. It was not a sudden appearance by the Shido that Perrin feared, but rather Massima. The men seemed to be following him meekly enough, but aside from this news of raiding, 9 Gildanen and 8 Mayenners had vanished in the last 2 weeks, and no one believed they had deserted. Before that, on the day Fail was stolen, 20 Mayenners had been ambushed and killed, and no one believed it had been anyone but Massima's men who did the killing. So an uneasy peace existed, a strange, thorny sort of peace, yet a copper wagered on it lasting forever was likely a copper lost. Massima pretended to be unaware of any danger to that peace, but his followers seemed not to care one way or the other, and whatever Massima pretended, they took their lead from him. Somehow, though, Perrin intended to see that it endured until Fail was free. Making his own camp too tough a nut to crack was one way of making the peace last. The Aiel had insisted on having their own thin wedge of the strange pie, though there were fewer than 50 of them, counting the Gaishain who served the wise ones, and he paused to study their low, dark tents. The only other tents erected anywhere in the camp were those of Berlaine and her 2 serving women, on the other side of the camp, not far from Brighton's few houses. Fleas and lice in hordes made those uninhabitable, even for hardened soldiers seeking shelter from the cold. The barns were putrid, ramshackle affairs that let the wind howl through, and harbored worse vermin than the houses. The maidens in Gaul, the only men among the Aiel not Gaishain, were all out with the scouts, and the Aiel tents were silent and still, though the smell of smoke coming from some of the vent holes told him the Gaishain were preparing breakfast for the wise ones, or serving it. Anura was Berlaine's advisor, and usually shared her tent, but Masuri and Sioned would be with the wise ones, maybe even helping the Gaishain with breakfast. They still tried to hide the fact that the wise ones considered them apprentices, though everyone in camp must be aware of it by now. Anyone who saw an Aes Sedai actually carrying firewood, or water, or heard one being switched, could make it out. The 2 Aes Sedai were oath-sworn to Rand. Again the colors whirled in his head, an explosion of hues. Again they met to his consternation, but Idara and the wise ones had been sent to keep an eye on them. Only the Aes Sedai themselves knew how tightly their oaths held them, or what room they saw to maneuver between the words, and neither was allowed to hop, unless a wise one said toad. Sioned and Masuri had both said Massima should be put down like a mad dog, and the wise ones agreed. Or so they said. They had no 3 oaths to hold them to the truth, though in truth that particular oath held the Aes Sedai more in letter than spirit. And he seemed to recall one of the wise ones telling him that Masuri thought that the mad dog could be leashed. Not allowed to hop unless a wise one said toad. It was like a blacksmith's puzzle with the edges of the metal pieces sharpened. He needed to solve it, with one mistake, and he could cut himself to the bone. From the corner of his eye, Perrin caught Bulwer watching him, lips pursed in thought. A bird studying something unfamiliar, not afraid, not hungry, just curious. Gathering Stepper's reins, he walked on so quickly that the little man had to lengthen his stride into small jumps to catch up. 2 Rivers men had the segment of camp next to the Aiel, facing northeast, and Perrin considered walking a little north to where Gildan and Lancers were camped, or south to the nearest Mayenne section. But taking a deep breath, he made himself lead his horse through his friends and neighbors from home. They were all awake, huddling in their cloaks and feeding the remnants of their shelters into the cook fires, or cutting up the cold remains of last night's rabbit to add to the porridge in the kettles. Talk dwindled, and the smell of wariness grew thick as heads lifted to watching. Whetstones paused in sliding along steel, then resumed their sibilant whispering. The bow was their preferred weapon, but everyone carried a heavy dagger or a short sword as well, or sometimes a long sword. And they had picked up spears and halberds and other pole arms with strange blades and points that the Shido had not thought worth carrying off with their pillage. Spears they were accustomed to, and hands used to wielding the quarterstaff at feast day competitions found the pole arms not much different once the weight of metal on one end was accounted for. Their faces were hungry, tired, and withdrawn. Someone raised a half-hearted cry of golden eyes, but no one took it up, a thing that would have pleased Perrin a month ago. A great deal had changed since Fail was taken. Now their silence was leaden. Young Kenley Merrin, his cheeks still pale where he had scraped off his attempt at a beard, avoided meeting Perrin's eyes, And Jory Conger, light-fingered whenever he saw anything small and valuable, and drunk whenever he could manage it, spat contemptuously as Perrin passed by. Van Craw punched Jory's shoulder for it, hard, but Van did not look at Perrin either. Daniel Lewin stood up, tugging nervously at the thick mustache that looked so ridiculous beneath his beak of a nose. "Orders, Lord Perrin." The skinny man actually looked relieved when Perrin shook his head. He sat down again quickly, staring at the nearest kettle as though he were anxious for the morning gruel. Maybe he was. Nobody got a full belly lately, and Daniel had never had much spare flesh on his bones. Behind Perrin, Aram made a disgusted sound very like a growl. There were others here besides Two Rivers folk, yet they were no better. Old Lamgwin Dorn, a hulking fellow with scars on his face, tugged his forelock and bobbed his head. Lamgwin looked like a shoulder-thumper, a tavern tough, but he was Perrin's body servant now, when he had need of one, which was not often, and he might just want to keep in a good odor with his employer. But Basil Gill, the stout one-time innkeeper Fail had taken on as their Shambayan, busied himself pulling his blankets with exaggerated care, keeping his balding head down, and Fail's chief maid, Vinnie Eltring, a bony woman whose tight white bun made her face seem even narrower than it was, straightened from stirring a kettle, her thin lips compressed, and raised her long wooden spoon as if to fend Perrin off. Brianna Taberwin, dark eyes fierce in her pale Carianan face, slapped Lamgwin's arm hard and frowned up at him. She was Lamgwin's woman, if not his wife, and the second of Fail's three maids. They would follow the Shido till they dropped dead if necessary, and fall on Fail's neck when they found her. But only Lamgwin had an ounce of welcome for Perrin. He might have gotten more from Jur Grady. The Ashenline were estranged from everyone else themselves, by who and what they were, and neither had shown any animosity toward Perrin. But despite the noise of people tramping about in the frozen snow and cursing when they slept, Grady was still wrapped in his blankets, snoring away beneath the pine branch lean-to. Perrin walked through his friends and neighbors and servants and felt alone. A man could only proclaim his faithfulness so long before he just gave up. The heart of his life lay somewhere to the northeast. Everything would return to normal once he had her back. A thicket of sharpened stakes 10 paces deep encircled the camp, and he went to the edge of the Gildan and Lancers section, where angled paths had been left for mounted men to ride out, though Walwer and Aram had to fall in behind him in the narrow way. In front of the Two Rivers men, a man afoot would have to twist and turn to make it through. The edge of the forest lay little more than 100 paces distant, easy bowshot for Two Rivers men, huge trees thrusting a canopy high into the sky. Some of the trees here were strange to Perrin, pines and leatherleaf and elms out there, some as much as 3 or 4 paces thick at the base, and oaks that were larger still. Trees that big killed anything larger than weeds or small bushes that tried to grow beneath them, leaving wide spaces between. But shadows darker than the night filled those spaces. An old forest, one that could swallow armies whole and never give up the bones. Walwer followed him all the way through the stakes before deciding this was as close to alone with Perrin as he was likely to get any time soon. "The riders Messina had sent out, my lord," he said, and holding his glove close, he cast a suspicious look back at Aram, who met it with a flat stare. "I know," Perrin said. "You think they're going to the White Cloaks." He was eager to be moving, and that much farther from his friends. He put the hand holding his reins in the saddlebow, but refrained from putting a boot in the stirrup. Stepper tossed his head, also impatient. "Messima could be sending messages to the Shanchan just as easily." "As you have said, my lord. A viable possibility, to be sure. May I suggest once again, however, that Messima's view of Aes Sedai is very close to that of the White Cloaks? In fact, identical. He would see every last sister dead if he could. The Shanchan view is more pragmatic, if I may be permitted to call it that. Less in accord with Messima in any case." "However much you hate White Cloaks, Master Walwer, they aren't at the root of every evil. And Messima has dealt with the Shanchan before." "As you say, my lord." Walwer's face did not change, but he reeked of doubt. Perrin could not prove Messima's meetings with the Shanchan, and telling anyone how he had learned of them would only add to his present difficulties. That gave Walwer problems. He was a man who liked evidence. "As for the Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones, my lord, Aes Sedai always seem to believe they know better than anyone else, except possibly another Aes Sedai. I believe the Wise Ones are much the same." Perrin snorted brief white plumes in the air. Tell me something I don't know, like why Masuri would meet with Massima, and why the Wise Ones allowed it. I'll wager against a horseshoe nail she didn't do it without their permission. Anura was another question, but she could be acting on her own. It certainly seemed unlikely she was acting at Berline's behest. Shifting his cloak on his shoulders, Balwar peered back across the rows of sharpened stakes into the camp, toward the Aiel tents.
What are you doing?
Squinting as if he hoped to see through the tent walls.
It's okay.
There are many possibilities, my lord, he said testily. For some who swear an oath, whatever is not forbidden is permitted, and whatever is not commanded can be ignored. Others take actions they believe will help their liege without first asking permission. The Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones fall into one of those categories, it seems. But further than that, I can only speculate as matters stand. I could just ask. Aes Sedai can't lie, and if I press hard enough, Masuri might actually tell me the truth. Balwar grimaced as though at a sudden stomach pain. Perhaps, my lord, perhaps. More likely is that she would tell you something that sounds like the truth. Aes Sedai are experienced in that, as you know. In any event, my lord, Masuri would wonder how you knew to ask, and that line of thought might lead to Javier and Nerion. Under the circumstances, who can say who she might tell? Straightforward is not always the best way. Sometimes certain things must be done behind masks, for safety. I told you the Aes Sedai couldn't be trusted, Aurum said abruptly. I told you that, Lord Perrin. He fell silent when Perrin raised a hand, but the stink of fury from him was so strong that Perrin had to exhale to clear his lungs. Part of him wanted to draw the scent deep and let it consume him. Perrin studied Balwar carefully. If Aes Sedai could twist the truth till you could not tell up from down, and they could and did, how far could you trust? Trust was always the question. He had learned that in hard lessons. He took a firm check on his anger, though. A hammer had to be used with care, and he was working a forge where one slip would tear the heart out of his chest. And might matters change if some of Solanda's friends began spending more time among the Aiel? They want to be Aiel, after all. That ought to give them enough excuse. And maybe one of them can strike up a friendship with Berling, and with her advisor. That should be possible, my lord, Balwar said, after the slightest hesitation. Lady Midori's father is a High Lord of Tyr, giving her sufficient rank to approach the First of Man, and also a reason. Possibly one or two of the Karianen stand high enough as well. Finding those to live among the Aiel will be easier still. Perrin nodded. Infinite care with the hammer, however much you wanted to smash whatever lay within reach. Then do it. But Master Balwar, you've been trying to guide me to this since Solanda left us. From now on, if you have a suggestion to make it. Even if I say no to 9 in a row, I'll always listen to a 10th. I'm not a clever man, but I'm willing to listen to people who are, and I think you are. Just don't try poking me in the direction you want me to go. I don't like that, Master Balwar. Balwar blinked, then of all things, bowed with his hands folded at his waist. He smelled surprised and gratified. Gratified? As you say, my lord. My previous employer disliked me suggesting actions unless I was asked. I won't make the same mistake again, I assure you. Eyeing Perrin, he seemed to reach a decision. If I may say so, he said carefully, I have found serving you pleasant in ways I did not expect. You are what you seem, my lord, with no poisoned needles hidden away to catch the unwary. My previous employer was known widely for cleverness, but I believe you are equally clever in a different way. I believe I would regret leaving your service. Any man might say these things to keep his place, but I mean them. Poisoned needles? Before entering Perrin's service, Balwar's last employment had been as secretary to a Mirandian noblewoman, fallen into hard times, who could no longer afford to keep him. Mirandi must be a rougher place than Perrin thought. I see no reason for you to leave my employ. Just tell me what you want to do and let me decide. Don't try to prod. And forget the flattery. I regret shaking myself. once more. He had never been this formal before. "If you have no further questions, my lord, may I go to find the Lady Medora?" Perrin nodded. The little man backing away, his cloak fluttering behind him as he dodged through the sharpened stakes, like a sparrow hopping across the snow. He was a strange fellow. "I don't trust him," Aram muttered, staring after Bulwer. "And I don't trust Solanda and that lot. They'll throw in with the Aes Sedai, you mark my words." "You have to trust somebody," Perrin said roughly. The question was, who? Swinging into Stepper's saddle, he booted the dun in the ribs. Hannah was useless, lying at rest. Chapter 6. The Scent of a Dream. The cold air seemed clean and fresh in Perrin's nose as he galloped into the forest. The breeze was full of the crispness of the snow that fountained in sprays beneath Stepper's hooves. Out here he could forget old friends who were willing to believe the worst on rumor. He could try to forget Massima and the Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones. The Shida was on the inside of his skull, however, a puzzle that would not yield no matter how he twisted. He wanted to wrench it apart, but that never worked with a blacksmith's puzzle. After one short burst of speed, he slowed the dun to a walk, feeling a touch of guilt. The darkness beneath the forest canopy was deep. The tops between the tall trees warned of more hidden beneath the snow, 100 places that might break a running horse's leg, and that without counting gopher holes and fox dens and badger sets. There was no need to take the risk. A gallop would not free Fail an hour sooner, and no horse could maintain that pace for long in any case. The snow here was knee-deep in places where it had drifted, and deep enough elsewhere. He rode northeast, though. The scouts would be coming from the northeast, with news of Fail. News of Shido, at least a location. He had hoped for that so often, prayed for it. But today, he knew it would come. Yet knowing only increased his anxiety. Finding them was only the first part of solving his puzzle. Anger made his mind flash from one thing to another, yet no matter what Bulwer said, Perrin knew he was methodical at best. He did not do well trying to think quickly, and lacking cleverness, methodical was going to have to do. Somehow. Aram caught up to him, running his gray hard, and just a little behind him to one side like a heeling hound. Perrin led him. Aram never smelled comfortable when Perrin made him ride alongside. The one time Tinker did not speak, but eddies in the icy air brought his scent, a melange of anger and suspicion and disgruntlement. He sat his saddle as tense as an overwound clock spring and watched the forest around them grimly, as though he expected Shido to leap out from behind the nearest tree. In truth, almost anything could have hidden from most men in these woods. Where the sky overhead could be seen through the canopy of branches, it held a definite tinge of dark grayness, but for the moment that cast the forest in shadows murkier than night, and the trees themselves were massive columns of darkness. Yet even the shift of a black-winged jackdaw on a snow-mounted branch, its feathers fluffed against the cold, caught Perrin's eyes, and a hunting pine marten, a deeper black than the darkness, cautiously raising its head on another. He caught the scent of both, too. A faint whiff of man-scent came from up in a massive oak with dark spreading limbs as thick as a pony. The Gildanan and Mayanners had their mounted patrols circling the camp a few miles out, but he preferred to rely on 2 Rivers men closer in. He did not have enough men to ring the camp completely, yet they were used to forests and to hunting animals that might hunt them in turn, used to noticing movement that would escape a man thinking in terms of soldiers in war. Ridge cats down from the mountains after sheep could hide in plain sight, and bear and wild boar were known to double back on their pursuers and lie in ambush. From branches 30 and 40 feet above the ground, the men could see anything that moved below in time to warn the camp, and with their longbows they could exact a heavy price from anyone who tried to force a way past them. Yet the presence of the guard touched his mind as lightly as the presence of the jackdaw. He was focused ahead through the trees and the shadows, intent on picking up the sign of the scouts returning. Abruptly, Stepper tossed his head and snorted in a spew of mist, eyes rolling in fear as he stopped dead, and Aram's gray squealed and shied. Perrin leaned forward to pat the trembling stallion's neck, but his hand froze as he caught a trace of scent, a smell of burned sulfur faint in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck try to stand. Almost burnt sulfur. That was only a pale imitation of this smell. It had a reek of wrongness, of something that did not belong in this world. The scent was not new, You could not ever have called that stink fresh, but not old either. An hour, perhaps less. Maybe about the time he had wakened, about the time he had dreamed of this scent. What is it, Lord Perrin? Aram was having difficulty controlling his grey, which danced in circles fighting the reins and wanted to run in any direction so long as it was away. But even while sawing at his reins, he had his wolf-head pummeled sword out. He practiced with it daily, for hours on end when he could. Those who knew about such things said he was good. You may be able to make out a black thread from a white in this, but it isn't day yet to me. I can't see anything well enough to matter. Put that away, Perrin told him. It isn't needed. Swords wouldn't do any good anyway. He had to cover not to go forward, but he followed the ranks, uncovered ground ahead. He knew that smell, not just from the dream. It only took a little while to find what he was looking for. Stepper gave a grateful whicker when Perrin reined him in well short. A stone 2 paces wide that jutted up to the The snow all around was smooth and unmarked. Tracks covered the tilted span of stone, as though a pack had scrambled over it as they ran. Dimness and shadows or no, they were plain to Perrin's eyes. Footprints larger than the palm of his hand, pressed into the stone as though it had been mud. He patted Stepper's neck again. No wonder the animal was frightened. Go back to the camp and find Daniel Aram. Tell him I said to let everyone know there were dark hounds here, maybe an hour ago. And put your sword away. You wouldn't want to try killing a dark hound with a sword, believe me. Dark hounds? Aram exclaimed, peering around into the murky shadows between the trees. There was an anxious fear in his scent now. Most men would have laughed about travelers' tales or tinkered on the countryside and knew it could be found in them. Aram sheathed the sword on his back with obvious reluctance. His right hand remained raised. How do you kill a dark hound? Can he be killed? Then again, maybe he did not have much good sense at that. Just be glad you don't have to try, Aram. Now go do like I told you. Everyone needs to keep a sharp lookout in case they come back. Not much chance of that, I'd say, but better safe. Perrin remembered facing a pack of them once and killing one. He thought he had killed one after hitting it with 3 good broadhead arrows. Shadow Spawn did not die easily. Moraine had had to finish that with balefire. Make sure the Aes Sedai and Wise Ones learn of this, and the Ashaman. Small chance any of them knew how to make balefire. The women might not admit knowing a forbidden weave if they did, or maybe not the men either. But maybe they knew something else that could work. Aram was reluctant to leave Perrin alone until Perrin snapped at him, and then he turned back toward the camp, trailing smells of umbrage and hurt, as if 2 men would have been a whit safer than 1. As soon as the other man was out of sight, Perrin reined Stepper southward, the direction the Darkhounds had been heading. He did not want company for this, even Aram's. Just because people sometimes noted his sharp eyesight was no reason to flaunt it, or his sense of smell. There were already reasons enough to shun him without adding more. It might have been chance that the creatures had passed so near his camp. The last few years had made him uneasy with coincidences. All too often, they were not coincidence at all, not the way other men counted such things. If this was another bit of his Taviran tugging at the pattern, it was a bit he could have done without. The thing seemed to have more disadvantages than advantages, even when it appeared to be working in your favor. The chance that favored you one minute could turn on you in the next. And there was always another possibility. Being Taviran made you stand out in the pattern. Some of the Forsaken could use that to find you at times. Or so he had been told. Maybe some Shadow Spawn could, too. The trail he followed was surely near an hour old, but Perrin felt a tightness between his shoulder blades, a prickling on his scalp. The sky was still a deep dark gray where it showed, even to his eyes. The sun had not yet crested the horizon. Just before sunrise was one of the worst times to meet the wild hunt, when darkness was changing to light, but the light had not taken hold. At least there was no crossroads nearby, no graveyard, but the only hearthstones to touch lay back in Brighton, and he was not certain how much safety those hovels held. In his mind, he marked out the location of a nearby stream, and got its water by chopping through the ice. It was no more than 10 or 12 paces wide and only knee-deep, but putting running water between you and Darkhounds would stop them, supposedly. But then, so would facing them, supposedly. and he had seen the results of that. His nose tested the breezes, searching for that old scent, and for any hint of a newer. Coming on these things unaware would be worse than unpleasant. Stepper caught scents almost as easily as Perrin, and sometimes noticed what they were sooner. But whenever the Dun balked, Perrin forced him forward. There were plenty of tracks scattered in the snow, hoofprints of the mounted patrols going out and coming back, occasional sign of rabbits and foxes. But the only marks left by the Darkhounds were where stones stuck up out of the snow. The burnt sulfur smell was always strongest there, yet enough trace lingered in between to lead him to the next place where their tracks showed. The huge paw prints overlapped one another, and there was no way to tell how many Darkhounds there had been. But whether a pace wide or 6, every rock surface they had crossed carried tracks from one side to the other. A larger pack than the 10 he had seen outside Ilion. Much larger. Was that why there were no wolves in the area? He was sure that the certainty of death he had felt in the dream was something real, and he had been a wolf in the dream. As the trail began to curve to the west, he felt a growing suspicion that firmed into certainty as it continued to bend. The Darkhounds had circled the camp completely, running right across the place north of the camp where several huge trees lay half-toppled and propped by their neighbors, each with a tall chunk sliced cleanly out of its splintered trunk. The tracks covered a stone outcrop as smooth and flat as a polished marble floor, except for one hair-thin gouge cut through it straight as a plumb line. Nothing resisted the opening of an Ashaman's gateway, and 2 had opened here. A thick pine that had fallen blocking one had a section 4 paces wide burned out of it, but the charred ends were as neat as if they had come from a sawmill. It seemed that evidence of the one power did not interest Darkhounds, however. The pack had not paused there any more than anywhere else, or even slowed that he could tell. Darkhounds could run faster than horses, and for longer, and the stench of them hardly seemed to have faded more in one place than another. At 2 points in that circuit, he had picked up a forking in the trail, but that was only the pack coming from the north, departing south. Once around the camp, and then on their way after whatever or whoever they were hunting. Plainly, that was not him. Perhaps the pack had circled because they sensed him, sensed someone who was Taviran, yet he doubted that Darkhounds would have hesitated one instant coming into the camp had they been after him. The pack he had faced before had entered the city of Ilion, though it had not tried to kill him till later. But did Darkhounds report what they saw the way rats and ravens did? The thought made his jaw clench. The Shadow's attention was something any sane man feared. The Shadow's attention might interfere with freeing Fail. That concerned him more than anything else. Yet there were ways to fight Shadow Spawn, ways to fight the Forsaken if it came to that. Whatever came between him and Fail, Darkhounds or the Forsaken or anything else, there was a way to go around or through, if necessary. A man could only have so much time, and all of his was on Fail. There just was no room for any more. Before he reached his starting place again, the breezes brought him the smells of people and horses, sharp in the icy cold. He arranged Stepper to a slow walk, and then to a halt. He had spotted some 50 or 60 horses, near 100 paces ahead. The sun had finally peaked above the horizon, and begun to send sharply slanted shafts of light through the forest canopy, reflecting off the snow, and lessening the gloom a little, though deep dappled shadows remained between the sun's slender fingers. Some of those shadows enveloped him. The mounted party was not far from where he had first seen the Darkhound's tracks, and he could see Arm's sickly green cloak and red-striped coat, the tinker garments jarring with the sword on his back. Most of the riders wore red-rimmed helmets shaped like pots, and dark cloaks over red breastplates, and the long red streamers on their lances stirred in the light airs as the soldiers tried to keep watch in every direction. The 1st of Mayan often rode out in the mornings with a suitable bodyguard of the winged guards. He started to slip away without having to meet Berylane, but then he saw 3 tall women afoot among the horses, long dark shawls wrapped around their heads and draped over their upper bodies, and he hesitated. Wise ones rode when they had to, if unwillingly, but tramping a mile or 2 in the snow, wearing heavy woolen skirts, was insufficient reason to force them onto horseback. Almost certainly, Sionid or Missouri was in that group as well, though the Aiel women seemed to like Berylane for some reason he could not fathom. He had no thought of joining the riders, no matter who was with them, but hesitation cost him his chance at evasion. One of the wise ones, he thought it was Corell, a fire-haired woman, who always had a challenge in her sharp blue eyes, raised a hand to point in his direction, and the whole party turned, the soldiers whipping their horses around and peering through the trees toward him, lances tipped with a foot of steel half lowered. It was unlikely they could make him out clearly through the deep pools of shadow and bright bars of sunlight. He was surprised the wise one had, but then Aiel generally had sharp eyes. Missouri was there, a slim woman in a bronze-colored cloak, riding a dapple mare, and Anura as well, keeping her brown mare well back, but marked by the dozens of thin, dark braids that hung from the open. Berelaine herself sat gelding at the forefront, a tall, beautiful young woman with long black hair and a red cloak lined with black fur. A simple flaw lessened her beauty, though. She was not Fail. A worse flaw ruined it, as far as he was concerned. He had learned of Fail's kidnapping from her, and of Massima's contact with the Shanshan, but nearly everyone in the camp believed that he had slept with Berelaine on the very night Fail was taken, and she had done nothing to correct the tale. It was hardly the kind of story he could ask her to stand up and deny publicly, yet she could have said something, told her maids to deny it, anything. Instead, Berelaine held her silence, and her maids, gossiping like magpies, actually fostered the tale. That sort of reputation stuck to a man in the Two Rivers. He had avoided Berelaine since that night, and he would have ridden away now, even after they saw him. But she took a hoop-handled basket from the maid accompanying her, a plump woman wrapped in a blue and gold cloak, then spoke to the others and started her sleek bay gelding toward him. Alone. Anura raised a hand and called something after her, but Berelaine never glanced back. Perrin did not doubt she would follow wherever he went, and the way things were, leaving would only make people believe he wanted to be private with her. He dug his heels into Stepper's flanks, meaning to join the others no matter how little he wanted to, let her follow him back to them if she wanted. But she urged the bay to a canter, despite the rough ground and the snow, even leaping a stone outcrop, her red cloak flowing out behind her, and met him halfway. She was a good rider, he admitted grudgingly. Not as good as Fail, but better than most. Your scowl is quite fierce, she laughed softly as she halted right in front of Stepper. From the way she held her reins, she was ready to block him if he tried going around. The woman had no shame at all. Smile, so people think we are flirting. She pushed the basket at him with one crimson-gloved hand. This should make you smile, at least. I hear you forget to eat. Her nose wrinkled. And to wash, it seems. Your beard needs trimming, too. A careworn, somewhat disheveled husband rescuing his wife is a romantic figure. But she might not think so well of a dirty ragamuffin. No woman will ever forgive you, ruining her image of you. Suddenly confused, Perrin took the basket, sitting it in front of him on the tall pommel of his saddle, and unconsciously rubbed at his nose. He was accustomed to certain smells from Berelaine, usually those of a hunting she-wolf, and he was the intended prey. But today she gave off no hunting scent, not a whisker of it. She smelled patient as stone, and amused, with undercurrents of fear. The woman certainly had never been afraid of him that he recalled. And what did she have to be patient about? For that matter, what did she have to be amused about? A ridge cat smelling like a lamb would not have confounded him more. Confusion or no, his stomach rumbled at the aromas drifting from the lidded basket. Roasted wood hen, unless he was much mistaken, and bread still warm from the baking. Flour was in short supply, and bread almost as rare as meat. It was true that he missed eating some days. He really did forget sometimes. And when he remembered, eating was a chore, for he had to run the gauntlet of Linny and Brianna, or be given the cold shoulder by people he had grown up with just to get a meal. Food right under his nose made his mouth water. Would it be disloyal to eat food brought by Berelaine? Thank you for the loaf and the wood hen, he said roughly. But the last thing on earth I want is for anyone to think we're flirting. And I wash when I can, if it's any of your business. It isn't easy in this weather. Besides, nobody else smells any better than I do. He realized suddenly. There was no hint of sweat or dirt under her light, flowery perfume. It irritated him that he had noticed she was wearing perfume, but that she smelled clean. It seemed a betrayal. Berelaine's eyes widened momentarily in startlement. Why? But then she sighed through her smile, which was beginning to look fixed, and a thread of irritation entered her scent. Have your tent set up. I know there's a good copper bathtub in one of your carts. You won't have thrown that out. People expect a noble to look like a noble parent, and that includes being presentable, even when it takes extra effort. It's a bargain between you and them. You must give them what they expect as well as what they need or want, or they lose respect and start resenting you for making them lose it. Frankly, none of us can afford for you to let that happen. We're all far from our homes, surrounded by enemies, and I very much believe that you, Lord Perrin Goldeneyes, may be our only chance of living to reach our homes again. Without you, everything falls apart. Now smile, because if we're flirting, then we aren't talking about something else. Perrin bared his teeth. The Mayenners and the Wise Ones were watching, but at 50 paces in this gloom, it would be taken for a smile. Lose respect? Verlaine had helped strip him of any respect he once had from the Two Rivers folk, not to mention Fail's servants. Worse, Fail had given him some version of that lecture about a noble's duty to give people what they expected more than once. What he resented was hearing this woman, of all people, echo his wife. What are we talking about, then, that you don't trust your own people to know? Her face remained smooth and smiling, yet the undercurrent of fear in her scent strengthened. It was nowhere near panic, but she believed herself in danger. Her gloved hands were tight on the bay's reins. I've had my thief-catchers nosing about in Nosima's camp, making friends. Not as good as having eyes and ears there, but they took wine they supposedly stole from me, and they learned a little by listening. For an instant she regarded him quizzically, tilting her head. Light. She knew Fail used Solanda and those other idiots as spies. It had been Verlaine who told him about them in the first place. Likely Gendar and Santes, her thief-catchers, had seen Javier and Nerion in Massima's camp. Bulwer would have to be warned before he tried to set Midori on Verlaine and Anura. That would certainly make a fine tangle. When he said nothing, she went on. I put something in that basket besides bread and a wood hen. A document that Santos found early yesterday, locked away in Massima's camp desk. The fool never saw a lock without wanting to know what it hid. If he had to meddle with what Massima kept under lock and key, he should have memorized the thing instead of taking it. But what's done is done. Don't let anyone see you reading it after I went to all this trouble to hide it, she added sharply as he lifted the basket's lid, revealing a cloth-wrapped bundle and releasing stronger smells of roasted bird and warm bread. I've seen Massima's men following you before. They could be watching now. I'm not a fool, he growled. He knew about Massima's watchers. Most of the man's followers were townsmen, and most of the rest awkward enough in the woods to shame a 10-year-old back home. Which was not to say one or two might not be hiding somewhere among the trees close enough to spy from among the shadows. They always kept their distance, since his eyes made them believe he was some sort of half-tamed shadow spawn, so he seldom detected their scents. And he had had other things on his mind this morning. Fingering the cloth aside to expose the wood hen, almost as large as a fair-sized chicken, with its skin crisply browned, he tore off one of the bird's legs while feeling under the bundle and sliding out a piece of heavy cream-colored paper folded in 4. Careless of grease spots, he unfolded the paper atop the bird, a little clumsily in his gauntlets, and read while nibbling on the leg. To everyone watching, he would appear to be studying what part of the wood hen to attack next. A thick green wax seal, cracked on one side, held an impression of what he decided were 3 hands, each with the forefinger and little finger raised, and the others folded. The letters written on the paper in a flowing script were oddly formed, some unrecognizable, but the thing was readable with a little effort. The bearer of this stands under my personal protection. In the name of the Empress, may she live forever, give him whatever aid he requires in service to the Empire, and speak of it to no one but me. By her seal, Surath Sabel Madarath, of Asenbair and Barsaba, High Lady. The Empress, he said softly, soft like iron brushing silk. Confirmation of Massima's dealings with the Shonchan, though for himself he had needed none. It was not the sort of thing Verlaine would have lied about. Surath Sabel Meldareth must be someone important to be handing out this kind of document. This will finish him, once Santes testified where he found it. Service to the Empire? Massima knew Rand had fought the Shonchan. That rainbow burst into his head and was swept away. The man was a traitor. Verlaine laughed as if he had said something witty, but her smile definitely looked forced now. Santes told me no one saw him in the bustle of setting up camp, so I allowed him and Gendar to go back with my last cask of good Tanagan. They were supposed to return by an hour after dark, but neither has. I suppose they could be sleeping it off, but they've never... She broke off with a startled sound, staring at him, and he realized that he had bitten the thigh bone in half. Like he had stripped all the flesh from the leg without noticing. I'm hungrier than I thought, he muttered. Spitting the nub of bone into the palm of his gauntlet, he dropped the pieces to the ground. It's safe to assume Masima knows you have this. I hope you're keeping a heavy guard around you all the time, not just when you ride out. Galen has 50 men sleeping around my tent as of last night, she said, still staring, and he sighed. He would think she had never seen anybody bite a bone in two before. What has Anura told you? She wanted me to give it to her to destroy, so if I was asked, I could say I didn't have it, and didn't know where it was.
1 second, everyone.
And she
I'll be
could
right
support
back.
my word. I doubt that would satisfy Masima, though. No, I doubt it would. Anura had to know that, too. I said I could be wrong-headed, or even foolish upon occasion, but they were never stupid. Did she say she would destroy it, or that if you gave it to her, she could? Verlaine's brow furrowed in thought, and it took her a moment to say, that she would. The bay danced a few impatient steps, but she brought him under control easily without paying attention. I can't think what else she would want it for, she said after another pause. Masima is hardly likely to be susceptible to pressure. Blackmail, she meant. Baron could not see Masima standing still for that either, especially blackmail by an Aes Sedai. Under cover of tearing the other leg loose from the bird, he managed to refold the piece of paper and tuck it into his sleeve where his gauntlet would keep it from falling out. It was still evidence. But of what? How could the man be both a fanatic for the Dragon Reborn and a traitor? Could he have taken the document from... who? Some collaborator he had captured? But why would Masima keep it locked away, unless it had been meant for him? He had met with Seanchan. And how had he intended to use it? Who could tell what a thing this would allow a man to call on? Baron sighed heavily. He had too many questions and no answers. Answers required a quicker mind than his. Maybe Balwer would have a notion. With a taste of food in it, his stomach wanted him to devour the leg in his hand and the rest of the bird too, but he closed the lid firmly and tried to take measured bites. There was one thing he could find out for himself. What else has Anura said about Masima? Nothing, besides that he's dangerous and I should avoid him, as if I didn't know that already. She dislikes him and talking about him. Another brief hesitation, and Verlaine added, Why? The first of Mayenne was used to intrigues, and she listened for what was not said. Perrin took another bite to give himself a moment while he chewed and swallowed. He was not used to intrigues, yet he had been exposed to enough of them to know that saying too much could be dangerous. So could saying too little, no matter what Balwer thought. Anura has been meeting with Masima in secret. So has Masuri. Verlaine's fixed smile remained in place, but alarm entered her scent. She started to twist in her saddle as if to look back at the two Aes Sedai, and stopped herself, licking her lips with the tip of her tongue. Aes Sedai always have their reasons, was all she said. So was she alarmed over her advisor meeting Masima, or alarmed that Perrin knew, or... He hated all these complications. They just got in the way of what was important. Like he had managed to clean the second leg already. Hoping Verlaine had not noticed, he hastily tossed the bones aside. His belly growled for more. Her people had maintained their distance, but Aram had ridden a short way toward Perrin and Verlaine, and was leaning forward to peer at them through the shadowed trees. The wise ones were standing to one side talking among themselves, seemingly unaware that they were over their ankles in snow, or that the cold breezes had picked up enough to flap the dangling ends of their shawls. Every so often, one or another of the three looked Perrin and Verlaine's way too. Notions of privacy never kept a wise one from sticking her nose wherever she wanted. They were like Aes Sedai that way. Masuri and Anura were watching too, though they appeared to be keeping their distance from one another. Perrin would have wagered that without the wise ones there, both sisters would have been using the one power to eavesdrop. Of course, the wise ones probably knew how to do that too, and they'd allowed Masuri's visits to Masima. Would either Aes Sedai crack her teeth if they saw the Wise Ones listening with the power? Anora seemed almost as careful with the Wise Ones as Masuri was. Like he had no time for this briar thicket. He had to live in it, though. "We've given tongues enough to wag over," he said. Not that they needed any more than they had. Hooking the basket's hoop handles over his pommel, he heeled Stepper's flanks. It could hardly be disloyal just to eat a bird. Bearline did not follow immediately, yet before he reached Aram, she caught up and slowed her bay beside him. "I'll find out what Anora is up to," she said determinedly, looking straight ahead. Her eyes were hard. Baron would have pitied Anora if he had not been ready to try shaking answers out of her himself. But then, Aes Sedai seldom needed pity, and they seldom gave answers they did not want to give. The next instant, Bearline was all smiles and gaiety again, though the scent of determination still hung about her, almost pushing the fear scent. "Young Aram has been telling us all about Heartsbane riding these woods with the Wild Hunt, Lord Perrin. Could it really be so, do you think? I remember hearing those tales in the nursery." Her voice was light and amused and carrying. Aram's cheeks turned red, and some of the men beyond him laughed. They stopped laughing when Perrin showed them the tracks in the stone slab. Chapter 7. Blacksmith's Puzzle. When the laughter cut off, Aram put on a smug grin, and with none of the fear scent he had given off earlier. Anyone would have thought he had already seen the tracks himself, and knew everything there was to know. No one paid any mind to his smirk, however, or to much of anything except the huge dog tracks impressed in stone, even Perrin's explanation that the dark hounds were long gone. Of course, he could not tell them how he knew that, yet no one seemed to notice the lack. One of the sharply slanting bars of early morning light was falling directly on the gray slab, illuminating it clearly. Stepper had grown accustomed to the fading burnt sulfur smell. At least he only snorted and laid back his ears, but the other horses shied at the tilted stone. None of the humans except Perrin could detect that smell, and most growled over their mounts' fractious behavior and peered at the oddly marked stone as if it were a curiosity displayed by a traveling show. Bearlane's plump maid screamed when she saw the tracks and swayed on the point of falling off her round-bellied, nervously dancing mare, but Bearlane merely asked Nora in an absent fashion to look after her, and stared at the prince with as little expression as if she herself were Aes Sedai. Her hands tightened on her reins, though, until the thin red leather paled across her knuckles. Bertin Galen, the Lord Captain of the Winged Guards, his red helmet embossed with wings and bearing 3 thin crimson plumes, had personal command of Bearlane's bodyguard this morning, and he forced his tall black gelding close to the stone, swinging down from his saddle in knee-deep snow and removing his helmet, to frown at the stone slab with his one eye. A scarlet leather patch covered the empty socket of the other, the strap cutting through his shoulder-length gray hair. His grimace said he saw trouble, but he always saw the worst possibilities first. Perrin supposed that was better in a soldier than always seeing the best. Masuri dismounted too, but no sooner was she on the ground than she paused with her dapple's reins in one gloved hand, looking uncertainly toward the 3 sun-dark Aiel women. A few of the Mayenner soldiers muttered uneasily at that, yet they should have been used to it by now. Nora hid her face deeper in her gray hood as if she did not want to see the rock, and gave Bearlane's maid a brisk shake. The woman goggled at her in astonishment. Masuri, on the other hand, waited beside her mare with an appearance of patience, spoiled only by smoothing the russet skirts of her silk riding dress, as though unaware of what she was doing. The wise ones exchanged silent glances, expressionless as sisters themselves. Karel stood on one side of Navarin, a skinny green-eyed woman, and on the other, Marlene, with eyes of twilight blue and dark hair, rare among Aiel, not covered completely with her shawl. All 3 were tall women, as tall as some men, and none looked more than a few years older than Perrin, but no one could have managed that calm self-assurance without more years than their faces claimed. Despite the long necklaces and heavy bracelets of gold and ivory that they wore, their dark heavy skirts and the dark shawls that almost hid their white blouses could have suited farm women. Yet there was no doubt who was in command between them and the Aes Sedai. In truth, sometimes there seemed to be doubt who was in command between them and Perrin. Finally, Navarin nodded, and gave a warm and approving smile. Perrin had never before seen a smile out of her. Navarin did not walk around scowling, but she usually seemed to be searching for someone to upbraid. Not until that nod did Masuri hand her reins up to one of the soldiers. Her warder was nowhere to be seen, and that had to be the wise one's doing. Robert usually stuck to her like a burr. Lifting her divided skirts, she waded through the snow, deeper the closer to the stone she came, and began passing her hands above the footprints, obviously channeling, though nothing happened that Perrin could see. The Wise Ones watched her closely, but then Masuri's leaves were visible to them. Anura displayed no interest. The ends of the Grey Sister's narrow braids twitched as if she were shaking her head inside her hood, and she moved her horse back from the maid, well out of the Wise One's line of sight, but that took her farther from Bearland, who anyone could think might want her advice now. Anura really did avoid the Wise Ones as much as she could. "Fireside stories walking," Galen muttered, drawing his gelding away from the stone with a sideways glance at Masuri. Aes Sedai he honored, yet few men wanted to be close to an Aes Sedai who was channeling. "Though I don't know why I'm surprised anymore after what I've seen since leaving Marianne." Intent on the tracks, Masuri did not seem to notice him. A stir rippled through the mounted lancers, as though they had not really believed their own eyes until their commander gave confirmation. Some of them began to smell of uneasy fear, as if expecting dark hounds to leap out of the shadows. Perrin could not pick out individuals among so many with any ease, but the jittery rankness was strong enough that it had to come from more than a few. Galen seemed to sense what Perrin smelled. He had his faults, but he had commanded soldiers for a long time. Hanging his helmet on his longsword hilt, he grinned. The eye patch gave it a grim quality, a man who could see a joke in the face of death and expected others to see it too. "If the black dogs bother us, we'll salt their ears," he announced in a loud and hearty voice. "That's what you do in the stories, isn't it? Sprinkle salt in their ears and they vanish." A few of the lancers laughed, though the miasma of fear did not lessen appreciably. Stories told by the fire were one thing, those same stories walking in the flesh quite another. Galen led his black to Berelain, and rested a gauntleted hand on her bay's neck. He gave Perrin a considering look that Perrin returned levelly, refusing to take the hint. Whatever the man had to say, he could say in front of him and Aram. Galen sighed. "They will keep their nerve, milady," he said softly. "But the fact is, our position is precarious, with enemies on every side and our supplies running out. Shadow's spawn can only make matters worse. My duty is to you and Mayenne, milady, and with all respect to Lord Perrin, you may wish to alter your plans." Anger crackled in Perrin. The man would abandon Fail? But Berelain spoke before he could suggest it. "There will be no alteration, Lord Galen." Sometimes it was easy to forget that she was a ruler, small though Mayenne was, but there was a regal tone in her voice, fit for the Queen of Andor. Back straight, she made her saddle seem a throne, and she spoke loudly enough to make sure everyone heard her decision, firmly enough that everyone knew the decision had been made. "If we have enemies all around, then going on is as safe as turning back or turning aside. Yet if turning back or turning aside were 10 times safer, I would still go on. I intend to see the Lady Fail rescued if we must fight our way through 1,000 dark hounds and Trollocs as well. That I have sworn to do." A roar of cheers answered her, winged guards shouting and thrusting their lances into the air, so the red streamers danced. The smell of fear remained, but they sounded ready to cut their way through any number of Trollocs, rather than appear less in Berelain's eyes. Galen commanded them, but they felt more than fondness for their ruler, despite her reputation with men. Maybe because of it, in part. Berelain had kept Tyr from swallowing Mayenne by playing one man who found her beautiful against another. For his part, Perrin found it hard not to gape in surprise. She sounded as determined as he was. She smelled as determined. Galen bowed his gray head in unwilling acceptance. Berelain gave a small, satisfied nod before turning her attention to the Aes Sedai beside the stone slab. Masuri had stopped waving her hands about and was staring at the footprints, tapping a finger against her lips thoughtfully. She was a pretty woman, without being beautiful, though some of that might have been Aes Sedai agelessness, with a grace and elegance that might also have come from being Aes Sedai. It was often difficult to tell a sister who had been born on a hardscrabble farm from one born in a grand palace. Perrin had seen her red-faced and angry, worn down and on the end of her tether. Yet despite hard travel and life in the Aiel tents, her dark hair and her clothing looked as though she had a maid attending her too. She might have been standing in a library. "What have you learned, Masuri?" Berelain asked. "Masuri, if you please." "Masuri!" The last came a little more sharply. and Missouri gave a start, as though surprised to realize she was not alone. Possibly she was startled. In many ways, she seemed more of the green Aja than the brown, more intent on action than on contemplation, straight to the point and never vague. Yet she was still capable of losing herself completely in whatever captured her interest. Folding her hands at her waist, she opened her mouth, but rather than speaking, she hesitated and looked a question at the wise ones. "Go on, girl," Navarre said impatiently, landing her fists on her hips in a jangle of bracelets. A frown made her appear more her usual self, but neither of the other wise ones looked any more approving. 3 frowns in a row, like 3 pale-eyed crows on a fence. "We were not simply letting you exercise your curiosity. Get on with it. Tell us what you learned." Missouri's face reddened, but she spoke up immediately, her eyes on Barely. She could not like being called down in public, no matter what anyone knew of her relationship with the wise ones. "Relatively little is known of dark hounds, but I've made something of a study of them in a small way. Over the years, I've crossed the paths of 7 packs, 5 of them twice, and 2 others 3 times." The color began to fade from her cheeks, and slowly she began to sound as if she were lecturing. "Some ancient writers say there are only 7 packs. Others say 9 or 13, or some other number they believed had special significance. But during the Trolloc Wars, Sorlana Ausahan wrote of the 100 packs of the Shadow's hounds that hunt the night. And even earlier, Ivan el Baratia supposedly wrote of hounds born of the Shadow, in numbers like unto the nightmares of mankind. Though in truth, Ivanel herself may be apocryphal. In any case, she gestured as if groping for a word. Smell is not the right word, and neither is flavor. The sense of each pack is unique, and I can say with certainty that I have never encountered this one before, so we know the number 7 is wrong. Whether the correct number is 9 or 13 or something else, tales of dark hounds are much more common than dark hounds themselves, and they are extremely rare this far south of the Blight. A second rarity, there may have been as many as 50 in this pack. 10 or 12 is the usual limit. A useful maxim, 2 rarities combined call for close attention. Pausing, she raised a finger to emphasize the point, then nodded when she thought Berylin had taken it, and folded her hands again. A gusting breeze pushed her yellowish-brown cloak off one shoulder, yet she did not appear to notice the loss of warmth. There is always a feel of urgency about Darkhound's trails, but it varies according to a number of factors, not all of which I can be certain of. This one has an intense admixture of, I suppose you could call it impatience. That isn't really strong enough by far. As well call a stab wound a pinprick, but it will do. I would say their hunt has been going on for some time, and their prey is eluding them somehow. No matter what the stories say, by the way, Lord Gallen, salt doesn't harm darkhounds in the least. So she had not been entirely lost in thought after all. Despite the stories, they never hunt at random, though they will kill if the opportunity presents itself and doesn't interfere with the hunt. With darkhounds, the hunt is paramount. Their quarry is always important to the Shadow, though at times we cannot see why. They have been known to bypass the great and mighty to slay a farm wife or a craftsman, or to enter a town or village and leave without killing, though clearly they came for some reason. My first thought for what brought them here had to be discarded since they moved on. Her gaze flickered toward Perrin, so quickly he was not sure anyone else noticed. Given that, I strongly doubt they will return. Oh yes, and they are an hour or more gone. That, I'm afraid, is really all I can tell you. Navarre and the other wise ones nodded their approval as she finished, and a touch of color returned to her cheeks, though it vanished quickly as she assumed a mask of Aes Sedai serenity. A shift in the breeze brought her scent to Perrin, surprised and pleased, and upset at being pleased. "Thank you, Monsieur Sedai," Berylin said formally, making a small bow in her saddle that Missouri acknowledged with a slight motion of her head. "You have put our minds at rest." Indeed, the fierce smell among the soldiers began to fade, though Perrin heard Galen grumble under his breath. She might have told those last bits first. Perrin's ears caught something else, too, through the stamping of horses' hooves and men's quiet, relieved laughter. A blue tit's trill sounded to the south, beyond the hearing of anyone else there, followed closely by the buzzing call of a masked sparrow. Another blue tit sounded, closer, followed again by a masked sparrow, and then the same pair called again, closer still. There might be blue tits and masked sparrows in Altara, but he knew these birds carried Two Rivers longbows. The blue tit meant men were coming, more than a few, and maybe unfriendly. The masked sparrow, that some back home called the thief bird for its habit of stealing bright objects, on the other hand. Baron ran a thumb along the edge of his axe, but he waited for one more pair of calls, close enough that the others might have noticed. "Did you hear that?" he said, looking south as if he had just heard. "My sentries have spotted Masima." That brought heads up, listening, and several men nodded when the calls were repeated, closer still. "He's coming this way." Growling curses, Galen clapped his helmet onto his head and mounted. Anura gathered her reins, and Masuri began floundering back toward her dapple. The lancers shifted in their saddles and began giving off smells of anger, once more touched with fear. The winged guards were owed a blood debt by Masima in their eyes, but none was anxious to try collecting with only 50 men, not when Masima always rode with 100 at his back. "I will not run from him," Verlaine announced. She stared south, wearing a cold frown. "We will wait for him here." Galen opened his mouth and closed it again without speaking, to her at least. Drawing a deep breath, he began to bellow orders arraying his guardsmen. This was not an easy matter. No matter how far apart the trees stood, forests were poor places for lancers. Any charge would be disjointed at its start, and sticking a man with a lance was difficult when he could dodge behind a tree trunk and come up behind you. Galen tried to form them in front of Verlaine, between her and the approaching men, but she gave him a sharp look, and the one-eyed man changed his commands, lining the lancers up in a single crooked rank, bulging around massive trees but centered on her. One soldier Galen sent racing back toward the camp, crouching low in his saddle with his lance low, as if at the charge, riding as fast as he could in spite of the snow and terrain. Verlaine raised an eyebrow at that, yet said nothing. Anura began guiding her brown mare toward Verlaine, but stopped when Masuri called her name. The brown sister had gathered her dapple, but still stood in the snow with the wise ones around her, who were tall enough in comparison to make her seem less than full-grown. Anura hesitated until Masuri summoned her again, more sharply, and then Perrin thought he heard Anura sigh heavily before she rode to them and dismounted. Whatever the Aiel women had to say, in voices pitched too softly for Perrin to hear, clustering in front of Anura with heads bent close to hers, the Terabana sister did not like. Her face remained hidden in her hood, but her thin braids swung ever faster with the shaking of her head, and at last she turned away abruptly and put a foot in the stirrup of her saddle. Masuri had been standing quietly, letting the wise ones have their say, but now she laid a hand on Anura's sleeve and said something in a low voice that made Anura's shoulders slump, and the wise ones nod. Pushing back her hood to fall down her back, Anura waited for Masuri to climb onto her mare before mounting her own horse, and then the two sisters rode back to the line of lancers together, riding in beside Verlaine, with the wise ones pushing in between them, on the other side from Perrin. Anura's wide mouth was turned down in a glum curve, and she was rubbing her thumbs nervously. "What is it you're planning?" Perrin asked, trying not to hide suspicion. Maybe the wise ones had let Masuri meet with Masima, yet they still claimed to think the man was better dead. The Aes Sedai could not use the power as a weapon unless they were in danger, but the wise ones had no such prohibition. He wondered whether they were linked. He knew more than he wanted about the One Power, and enough about the wise ones to be sure that Navarran would be in control if they had formed a circle. Anura opened her mouth, but snapped it shut at a warning touch from Corell, and glared at Masuri. The brown sister pursed her lips and shook her head slightly, which did not seem to mollify Anura. Her gloved hands gripped her reins so tightly that they shook. Navarran looked up at Perrin past Verlaine, as if she read his mind. "We plan to see you safely back to the camp, Perrin Ebara," she said sharply. "You and Verlaine, Perron. We plan to see that as many as possible survive this day and the days to come. Do you have objections?" "Just don't do anything unless I tell you," he said. An answer like that could mean a lot of things. "Not anything." Navarran shook her head in disgust, and Corell laughed as if he had made a huge joke. None of the wise ones seemed to think any more response was needed. They had been commanded to obey him, but their notions of obedience failed to square with any he had ever learned. Pigs would grow wings before he got a better answer out of them. He could have put a stop to it. He knew he should. No matter what the wise ones had planned, meeting Masima this far from the others in the camp, and the man had to know who had stolen his Shonchan paper, was like hoping to snatch her hand off the anvil before the hammer fell. Berylane was almost as bad as the Wise Ones when it came to following orders, but he thought she would listen if he gave an order to withdraw to the camp. He thought she would, for all that her smell said she had dug her heels in hard. Staying was a senseless risk. He was sure he could convince her of that. Yet he did not want to run from the man either. Part of him said he was being a fool. The larger part smoldered with anger that he found hard to control. Aram crowded in beside him, scowling, but at least he had not drawn his sword. Waving a sword might put a hot coal in the hayloft, and the time for a confrontation with Masema had not come yet. Perrin rested a hand on his axe. Not yet. Despite the sharply angled rays of light that penetrated through the thick branches overhead, the forest as a whole lay wrapped in dim early morning shadows. Even at noon it would be dim here. Sounds came to him first, the muffled thud of hooves in snow, the heavy breath of horses pushed for speed, and then a mass of riders appeared, a disordered mob flowing north among the huge trees at a near gallop in spite of snow and rough ground. Rather than 100, they numbered 2 or 3 times that. A horse went down with a scream, and lay thrashing atop its rider, but none of the others so much as slowed until, some 70 or 80 paces away, the man at their head raised a hand, and they suddenly drew rein in sprays of snow, lathered horses blowing hard and steaming. Here and there lances stuck up among the riders. Most wore no armor, and many just a breastplate or a helmet, yet their saddles were hung about with swords and axes and maces. Shafts of sunlight picked out a few faces, grim, flat-eyed men who looked as though they had never smiled and never would. It occurred to Perrin that he might have made a mistake not to overrule Berylane. That was what came of hasty decisions, of letting anger do his thinking. Everyone knew that she often rode out in the mornings, and Masema might be desperate to recover his Shonchen document. Even with the Aes Sedai and Wise Ones, a fight in these woods could turn bloody, a free-for-all where men and women could die without once seeing who killed them. If no witnesses lived, he could always be blamed on bandits or even the Shido. That had happened before. And if there were witnesses left, Masema was not above hanging a few dozen of his own men and claiming the guilty had been punished. He likely wanted to keep Per and Abara alive for a while yet, though, and he would not have expected the Wise Ones or a second Aes Sedai. Small points to hang 50-odd lives on. Very small points to hang Fail's life on. Perrin eased his axe in its loop on his belt. Beside him, Berylane smelled of cool calm and stony determination. No fear, oddly. Not a whiff. Aram smelled excited. The 2 parties sat regarding one another in silence, until at last Masema rode forward, followed by just 2 men, all 3 pushing back their hoods. None wore a helmet or any piece of armor. Like Masema, Nengar and Bartu were Shinaran, but unlike him, they had shaved off their topknots, leaving bare heads with a look of skulls. The coming of the Dragon Reborn had broken all bonds, including those that had pledged these men to fight the Shadow along the Blight. Nengar and Bartu each carried a sword on his back and had another hanging at his saddle bow, and Bartu, shorter than the other 2, had a cased horse bow and a quiver fastened to his saddle too. Masema wore no visible weapons. The prophet of the Lord Dragon Reborn needed none. Perrin was glad to see Galen watching the men Masema had left behind, for there was something about Masema that drew the eye. Maybe it was only knowing who he was, but that was more than enough. Masema stopped his rangy sorrel a few paces from Perrin. The prophet was a dark, frowning man of average size, with a faded arrow scar white on his cheek. In a worn brown woolen coat and a dark cloak with frayed edges. Masema cared nothing for appearances, least of all his own. At his back, Nengar and Bartu held a fever in their eyes, but Masema's deep-set, almost black eyes seemed as hot as coals in a forge, as though the breezes must soon fan them to a glow, and his smell was the jangled, darting sharpness of pure insanity. He ignored the Wise Ones and Aes Sedai with a scorn he did not bother to hide. Wise Ones were worse than Aes Sedai, in his view. They not only blasphemed by channeling the One Power, they were Aiel savages to boot, a double sin. The winged guards could have been just more shadows beneath the trees. "You're taking a picnic," he said, with a glance at the basket hanging from Perrin's saddle. Normally Masema's voice was as intense as his eyes, but now it sounded wry, and his lip curled as his eyes traveled to Berylane. He had heard the rumors, of course. A wave of rage shot through Perrin, but he seized onto it, forcing it back. Pulling it in with the rest, folding it tight. His anger had one target, and he would not waste it striking at another. Catching his rider's mood, Stepper bared his teeth at Massima's gelding, and Perrin had to rein him in sharply. "There were dark hounds here in the night," he said, not very smoothly, but it was the best he could manage. "They're gone, and Masuri doesn't think they'll come back, so there's no need to worry." Massima did not smell worried. He never smelled of anything except madness. The sorrel thrust his head aggressively toward Stepper, but Massima pulled him up with a harsh jerk. He rode well, Massima did, but he treated his horses as he did people. For the first time he looked at Masuri. Perhaps his gaze grew a little hotter, if that was possible. "The shadow can be found everywhere," he said, a heated pronouncement of unquestionable truth. "No one need fear the shadow who follows the Lord Dragon Reborn. May the light illumine his name. Even in death they will find the final victory of the light." Masuri's mare shied as though burned by that gaze, yet Masuri controlled the animal with a touch on the reins and met Massima's stare with Aes Sedai inscrutability, as calm as a frozen pond. Nothing hinted that she had been meeting this man in secret. "Fear is a useful spur to the wits, and to determination when well controlled. If we have no fear of our enemies, that leaves only contempt, and contempt leads to the enemy's victory." You could have thought she was speaking to a simple farmer she had never met before. Anura, watching, looked a little ill. Was she afraid their secret would come out? That their plans for Massima could be spoiled? Massima's lip curled again, in a smile, or a sneer. The Aes Sedai seemed to cease to exist for him as he turned his attention back to Perrin. "Some of those who follow the Lord Dragon have found a town called Sohabor." That was how he always referred to his followers. They really followed the Dragon Reborn, not him. The fact that Massima told them what to do and when and how was just a detail. "A tidy place of 3,000 or 4,000 people, about a day back, or a little less, to the south and west. It seems they were out of the Aiel's path, and their crop was good last year, despite the drought. They have storehouses full of barley, millet, and oats, and other needful things, I should imagine. I know you are running short on fodder, for your men, as well as your horses." "Why would their storehouses be full this time of year?" Berelain leaned forward with a frown, her tone just short of a demand, and not far short of disbelief. Scowling, Nengar put a hand to his saddle sword. No one made demands of the prophet of the Lord Dragon. No one doubted him either. No one who wished to live. Leather creaked as lancers shifted their saddles, but Nengar ignored them. The smell of Massima's madness slithered and flailed in Perrin's nose. Massima studied Berelain. He seemed unaware of Nengar, or the lancers, or the possibility that men might start killing one another any moment. "A matter of greed," he said finally. "Apparently the grain traders of Sohabor thought to make larger profits by holding their stock until winter drove prices up. But they normally sell west, into Gildan and Amadisia, and events there and in Ebu Dar have made them fearful that anything they send out will be confiscated. Their greed has left them with full storehouses and empty purses." A note of satisfaction entered Massima's voice. He despised greed, but then he despised any human weakness, great or small. "I think they will part with their grain very cheaply now." Perrin smelled a trap, and it did not take a wolf's nose. Massima had his own men and horses to feed, and no matter how thoroughly they had scoured the country they crossed, they could not be in much better shape than Perrin's own people. Why had Massima not sent a few thousand of his followers into this town and taken whatever it held? A day back. That would take him farther from Fail, and maybe give the Shadow time to gain ground again. Was that the reason for this peculiar offer? Or a further delay to keep Massima in the west, close to his Shonchan friends? "Perhaps there will be time to visit this town after my wife is free." Once again, Perrin's ears caught the faint sound of men and horses moving through the forest before anyone else, coming from the west this time, from the camp. Galen's messenger must have galloped the whole way. "Your wife," Massima said in a flat voice, directing a look at Berelain that made Perrin's blood boil. Even Berelain colored, though her face remained smooth. "Do you really believe you will have word of her today?" "I do." Perrin's voice was as flat as Massima's, and harder. He clutched the pommel of his saddle, atop the hoop handles of Berelain's basket, to keep from reaching for his axe. Freeing her comes first. Her and the others. We can fill our bellies to bursting once that's done, but that comes first. The horses approaching were audible to everyone now. A long line of lancers appeared to the west, shifting through the shadowed trees with another mounted line behind it. The red streamers and breastplates of Mayenne interspersed with the green streamers and burnished breastplates of Gildan. The lines stretched from opposite Perrin down below the mass of horsemen who were waiting on Massima. Men afoot ghosted from tree to tree, carrying long Two Rivers bows. Perrin found himself hoping they had not stripped the camp too far. Stealing that Shanchan paper might have forced Massima's hand. And he was a veteran of fighting along the Blight and against the Aiel. He might have thought further ahead than simply riding out to find Barrelane. It was like another blacksmith's puzzle. Move one piece to shift another just enough to let a third slip free. A camp with weakened defenders could be overrun, and in these woods numbers could count for as much as who had people channeling. Did Massima want to keep his secret enough to try putting a seal to it here and now? Perrin realized that he had moved one hand to rest on his axe, but he left it there. Among the mass of Massima's followers, horses moved nervously at tugs from their riders. Men shouted and waved weapons, but Massima himself studied the oncoming lancers and bowmen with no change of expression, neither more dour nor less. They might have been birds hopping from branch to branch. The smell of him writhed madly, unchanging. "What is done to serve the light must be done," he said, when the newcomers halted, some 200 paces away. That was easy range for Two Rivers bowmen, and Massima had seen demonstrations, but he gave no sign that broadhead shafts might be aimed at his heart. "All else is dross and trash. Remember that, Lord Perrin Goldeneyes. Everything else is dross and trash." Jerking his sorrel around without another word, he headed back toward his waiting men, trailed by Nengar and Bartu, all three pushing their horses without a care for broken legs or broken heads. The waiting company fell in behind, a mob flowing south now. A few men at the tail end stopped to drag a limp shape from under the injured horse and put the animal out of its misery with a quick slash of a dagger. Then they began gutting and butchering. That much meat could not be allowed to go to waste. The rider they left where they had dropped him. "He believes every word he says," Honora breathed. "But where does his belief lead him?" Perrin considered asking her straight out where she thought Massima's belief was leading him, where she wanted to lead him. But she suddenly put on that impenetrable Aes Sedai calm. The tip of her sharp nose had turned red. She regarded him with a level stare. "You could pry that dark hound marked stone out of the ground barehanded as easily as get an answer from an Aes Sedai who wore that look. He would have to leave questions to Barrelane." The man who had brought the lancers suddenly spurred his horse forward. A short, compact fellow in a silver-plated breastplate and a helmet with a barred face guard and 3 short white plumes, Gerard Arganda was a tough man, a soldier who had worked his way up from the bottom, against all odds, to become the first captain of Alejandro's bodyguard. He had no liking for Perrin, south for no good reason, but Perrin expected him to stop and make his respectful call, perhaps confer with Galen. Arganda had a great deal of respect for Galen, and often spent time with him, both smoking their pipes. Instead, the roan floundered past Perrin and the others, Arganda digging his heels into the animal's sides, trying to force more speed. When Perrin saw where the man was heading, he understood. A single horseman on a mouse-colored animal was approaching from the east at a steady walk, and beside him an Aiel shuffled along on snowshoes. Chapter 8. Whirlpools of Color. Perrin did not realize he had moved until he found himself crouched at the stepper's neck, screeching after Arganda. The snow was no less deep, the ground no smoother, the light no better, but Stepper raced through the shadows, unwilling to let the roan stay in the lead, and Perrin urged him to run faster. The approaching rider was Elias, his beard fanned out over his chest, a broad hair catching his face in shadows, and his fur-lined cloak hanging down his back. The Aiel was one of the maidens, with a dark shupa wrapped around her head, and a white cloak, used for hiding against the snow, worn over her coat, with grays and browns and greens. Elias and one maiden, without the others, meant Aiel had been found. It had to. Arganda ran his horse without a care for whether he broke the roan's neck or his own, leaping stone outcrops, splashing through the snow at a near gallop. Stepper overtook him just as he reached Elias, and demanded in a harsh voice, "Did you see the queen, Machera? Is she alive? Tell me, man." The maiden, Elienda, her sun-darkened face expressionless, raised a hand to Perrin. It might have been meant for a greeting or sympathy, but she never broke her skimming stride. With Elias to make his report to Perrin, she would carry hers to the Wise Ones. You found her? Perrin's throat was suddenly dry as sand. He had waited so long for this. Arganda snarled soundlessly through the steel bars of his helmet's face guard, knowing that Perrin was not asking after Alejandra. We found the shadow, Elias said carefully, both hands on the pommel of his saddle. Even Elias, the fabled Longtooth who had lived and run with wolves, was showing the strain of too many miles and not enough sleep. His whole face sagged with a weariness emphasized by the golden yellow glow of his eyes beneath his hat-brim. Gray streaked his thick beard, and the hair that he wore hanging to his waist and tied with a leather cord at the nape of his neck. And for the first time since Perrin had known him, he looked old. They're camped around a fair-sized town they took, in ridge country near 40 miles from here. They've got no sentries to speak of close in, and those further out seem to be watching for prisoners trying to escape more than anything else. So we got near enough for a good look. But Perrin, there are more of them than we thought. At least 9 or 10 sets, the maiden said. Counting Gashine, folks in white anyway. There could be as many people in that camp as in Mayen or Abu Dar. I don't know how many spear fighters, but 10,000 might be on the low side from what I saw. Knots of desperation twisted and tightened in Perrin's stomach. His mouth was so dry he could not have spoken had Fail miraculously appeared in front of him. 10,000 Al-Gaid Siswai, and even weavers and silversmiths and old men who passed their days reminiscing in the shade would pick up a spear if they were attacked. He had fewer than 2,000 lancers, and they would have been overmatched against an equal number of Aiel. Fewer than 300 Two Rivers men, who could wreak havoc with their bows at a distance, but not stop 10,000. That many Shadow would shred Massima's murderous rabble like a cat slaughtering mice. Even counting the Asham ones and Aes Sedai, Idara and the other Wise Ones were hardly generous in what they told him about Wise Ones. But he knew 10 septs might have 50 women who could channel, maybe more. Maybe fewer, too. There was no set number, but not enough fewer to make a difference. With an effort, he strangled the despair welling up in him, squeezed until only writhing filaments remained for his anger to burn up. A hammer had no place in it for despair. 10 septs for the whole Shido clan. They still had Fail, and he still had to find a way. What does it matter how many there are? Aram demanded. When Trollocs came to the Two Rivers, there were thousands, tens of thousands. But we killed them just the same. Shido can't be worse than Trollocs. Perrin blinked, surprised to find the man right behind him, not to mention Berlain and Galen and the Aes Sedai. In his haste to reach Elias, he had shut out everything else. Dimly visible through the trees, the men Arganda had brought out to confront Massima still held their rough lines, but Berlain's bodyguard was forming a loose ring centered on Elias and facing outward. The Wise Ones stood outside the circle, listening to Elienda with grave faces. She spoke in a low murmur, sometimes shaking her head. Her view of matters was no brighter than Elias's. He must have lost the basket in his haste or thrown it away because it hung from Berlain's saddle now. There was a look of, could it be sympathy on her face? Burnham was too tired to think straight. Only now more than ever he had to think straight. His next mistake might be the last for Fail. Way I heard it, Tinker, Elias said quietly. The Trollocs came to you in the Two Rivers, and you managed to catch them in a vice. You have any fancy plans for catching the Shido in a vice? Aram glared at him sullenly. Elias had known him before he took the sword, and Aram disliked being reminded of that time, despite his brightly colored clothes. 10 septs or 50, Arganda growled. There must be some way to free the Queen. And the others, of course. And the others. His hard-bitten face was creased in a scowl of anger, yet he smelled frantic. A fox ready to chew off its own leg to escape a trap. Will they accept a ransom? The Gildanon looked around until they found Marlene coming through the winged guards. She managed a steady stride in spite of the snow, not staggering in the least. The other Wise Ones were no longer anywhere to be seen among the trees, nor Elienda. Will these Shido take a ransom, Wise One? Arganda's honorific had the sound of an afterthought. He no longer believed the Aiel with them had any knowledge of the kidnapping, but there was a taint in him regarding Aiel. I cannot say. Marlene seemed not to notice his tone. Arms folded across her chest, she stood looking at Perrin rather than Arganda. It was one of those looks where a woman weighed and measured you. She could have sewn you a suit of clothes or told you when your small clothes were last washed. It would have made him uncomfortable back when he had had time for such things. When she spoke again, there was nothing of offering advice in her tone, merely a setting out of the facts. She might even have meant it so.
See, my battery just went dead. Yep. On my speaker. Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. Appreciate all y'all support.